Yemen has been devastated by asymmetrical aerial bombardment by a Saudi-led coalition, and the war in Yemen, along with a Saudi-imposed blockade, is having disastrous impacts on food and water security. The United Nations reports in October that more than half of Yemen's 28 million people are short of food. At least 1.5 million children are going hungry in the poorest country on the Arabian Peninsula, including nearly 400,000 who are suffering from malnutrition so severe that it's weakening their immune systems. And these Saudi-led attacks continue, striking Yemen's hospitals, which are running out of medicine. All the while, these attacks have continued to receive backing from the United States, Israel, and the United Kingdom since they began on March 26, 2015. Even the New York Times admits that the deadly Saudi project in Yemen couldn't go on without U.S. support. But the Obama administration has said that while they may start halting some arms sales to Saudi Arabia, they're going to push ahead with training the Gulf Kingdom's Air Force to improve targeting. Now, the people of Yemen are without food, water, medicine, and fuel. The death toll in Yemen is so high that the Red Cross has started donating morgues to hospitals. And if that weren't enough, the military campaign has not only empowered Al-Qaeda to step into a vulnerable situation, it's actually made them richer, according to Reuters. Still, the Saudi government continues to block any kind of diplomatic solution in Yemen. Riyadh even threatened to cut funding to the UN over its inclusion on a list of children's rights offenders, effectively weaponizing humanitarian aid. Yet the crisis unfolding in Yemen goes routinely underreported in the mainstream media. Hard-hitting coverage is kept to a minimum by those controlling the narrative, namely outlets loyal to the US and its allies, which are enabling these atrocities. Now, here to discuss the crisis in Yemen and what this war is really about is Catherine Shakdam, a political analyst, author, and director of programs with the Shafakna Institute for Middle Eastern Studies. She's also an expert on Yemen. A Tale of Grand Resistance, Yemen, the Wahhabi, and the House of Saud is her latest book, and in it she explores that real story of resistance against Saudi Arabia's influence on the impoverished state. Check it out. Catherine, thank you so much for joining me today. I want to begin by talking about the backstory to the crisis in Yemen, because the situation there has been rapidly declining. Now much of the population is facing famine that will undoubtedly impact the health and development of the country's youngest generation, but most people don't even know how this conflict got started. Tell us about that.
When it comes to figures and the tally that is coming out, it depends who you're listening to. So, for example, the United Nations has given different figures. For example, they talked about 7,000 dead, and then it went up to 9,000, 10,000, 11,000. But for example, the Shafakna Institute has actually done an independent research working with the Mona Relief Organization, and they have found that so far we have been able to account 15,000 civilian deaths. We're not talking about those who are actually who died in the front line. We're just talking about civilians, and this of course doesn't account for those who died from famine or from I would say collateral damage from the war, for example, lack of medicine and things like this, because in this case, we're talking, maybe 40, 50,000 people. So it really depends how and who you include in those figures. And of course, I think that a lot of it has redacted and kind of manipulated in a way that people don't feel horrified. If you recall just a few years ago, people were talking about 26 million people in Yemen. Now the UN is actually registering 24 million. So if you just do the calculation and the math, you realize there's a kind of like a 2 million deficit. Where those 2 million people went, we're not quite sure. And there's always this fear that they actually, those people are actually dead, but not accounted for. And that's the problem. There's 3 million, internally displaced people right now in Yemen who are living in dire condition. We're talking about living in caves. People's homes and hospitals and schools and mosques have been completely obliterated, and they have literally nowhere to go. So when we talk about the situation in Yemen, I cannot stress enough how dire it is and how unspeakably bleak it is. Saudi Arabia and its coalition has done everything it can to completely obliterate Yemen's civil institutions and Yemen, I would say, as a nation state, because there is nowhere in Yemen you could actually walk into and not face the catastrophe of war. And we're talking absolute devastation. If you look, I think if you wanted to understand what Yemen looks like today, you would have to look at Aleppo, for example, to kind of have an idea of the degree of destruction that Saudi Arabia has rained onto Yemen. And I'm talking about hysterical bombing, obliteration of land, of agricultural land, of hospitals, of, power grid, everything that is actually standing up is now in ashes because Saudi Arabia wished it so. And the world is completely oblivious because Yemen, of course, is sitting under a media blackout, and no one is really interested in hearing what the Yemeni have to say because Yemen is one of the most impoverished nations in Saudi Arabia, and who cares about Yemen and who cares about the voice of the oppressed? And I know that it sounds like a cliche, but it is a reality. Yemen is not being heard. People are not giving the courtesy of their own truth and their political future. Yemen has already spoken against this war many times over. They have spoken against those who wish to destroy it, and still the world is not hearing them.
Right, and I'm glad you talked about the dynamics, and it is definitely a complex situation. But like any war, there's always economic interests that feed into the narrative and the agenda of these wars. So, how much of this conflict has to do with oil, for example, or the military-industrial complex and U.S. corporate empire and profits in general?
I do believe that what the US is trying to do is actually spend the Saudi financially by really, selling them as often as possible and kind of setting them up for failure because they realize that Yemen will be Saudi Arabia, Vietnam. But of course, they're making billions of dollars on the back of the Saudi. And it makes sense for war capitalists back in Washington. They make money. Who cares? They don't really care who dies in the process. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't actually, it's not relevant to them. The blood of the innocent, again, doesn't bother them that much as long as they make, they make them line. Now, the other thing that I believe we need to really pay attention to is the fact that Saudi Arabia has been, promoting Wahhabism in Syria and in Iraq to kind of, propel different radical groups, like Al-Nusra or Boko Haram, for example, in Nigeria and other places in the world. Now, I do believe that it's a form of deflection, I would say, because Saudi Arabia has always had its eye on Yemen. The problem is it couldn't exactly declare war on this one country because then, of course, we would have, I think, took offense and said, well, you can't exactly declare war on a country just because you feel like it. You would have had to have special, I would say, circumstances kind of be set up for the world to look away. And of course, with Syria and Iraq, the world is literally looking away and is more preoccupied with what is happening with Daesh than it is about Yemen, because again, who cares about Yemen? The problem with Yemen, that it might be most, the poorest nation in Southern Arabia, it nevertheless sits at a very key strategic crossroads in terms of, geopolitics, and it's sitting atop the world oil route. Why is this important? Well, essentially because if Saudi Arabia is actually to take control of Yemen, then they would have a monopoly over all the, natural resources of the world. And we all know that it would essentially mean that Saudi Arabia would be able to dictate certain agenda to Western powers, but not just Western powers, I would say the world entirely. So you would, if you can kind of make a correlation, if you look at how, the UN was actually blackmailed by Saudi Arabia earlier this year, you can only imagine what the kingdom would do if it was given, the key to the world oil route, and how very much of tyranny could be over world politics. Now, I very much doubt that the US is not aware of this reality. I think that they do understand this. But what they're doing is actually spending Saudi Arabia the same that they spent Iraq, if you recall, when they decide to fund Saddam Hussein's war against Iran, before they actually flipped against his regime. I think that we really need to kind of look into history and understand that, those kind of games that are being played today, those alliances that we see shaping, are not forever. That we need to kind of look past short term and understand that the Saudi are being set up. They are actually well overdue for a revolution. They have today is like 53 or almost 54 billion dollar deficit. They can't continue to fund war. They can't continue to silence the world by throwing billions of dollars at various parties. Something's going to have to give. And if I would say Syria is anything to kind of judge by, Yemen is set up will be victorious because the Yemeni people have no choice but to defeat Saudi Arabia, because otherwise it's actually the death of them, quite literally. They understand that, and so they will be fighting. Now, the problem is they are standing by themselves because other countries such as Iran and Russia, for example, are already politically invested in Syria and in Iraq, and they can't possibly take a chance on Yemen now because it would be too, they would overspend politically, and so they had to make a choice. But again, I think that Saudi Arabia was actually planning on this, which is why it first set up Syria and Iraq as the main war theater in the Greater Middle East, so that the people first of all, powers would not invest in Yemen. Second, media would not look at Yemen, and that people would maybe not pay attention to what it is that they're trying to do, which is essentially take control over Arabia to then propel, this kind of hegemonic Wahhabist agenda. And I think that we need to really pay attention to this. You need to understand what it is that is coming out of the mouth of Saudi clerics in Saudi Arabia. We never really listen to what it is that say and the kind of idea that they're promoting, and that they're promoting not only in their country, but outside. Because, in England, for example, 90% of all the most Islamic centers are being funded by Saudi Arabia. So if you imagine what Wahhabi, what Daesh militants are saying, for example, in Syria and Iraq, you have to understand that the same narrative is being played out in the US, in the UK, in France, and other countries across the world. We need to ask ourselves the question, do we really want to look at Yemen and not understand that what is happening in Yemen could happen anywhere else in the world if given the chance, if we allow this to continue to do what it is that they do today?
And Catherine, there's obviously a major media blackout on the crisis in Yemen, unlike other crises that we see constantly being covered, like in Syria or elsewhere. How can we disrupt the mainstream media blackout on Yemen and help mobilize action against U.S. involvement, specifically for their direct role in basically allowing this conflict to even happen?
Yemen is not Iran. It has nothing to do with Iran. We need to stop, giving into those labels and to try to actually look at countries and understand that if we claim ourselves, we claim democracy for ourselves, we claim freedom for ourselves, can we please give other people, other nations the same courtesy? This is all the Yemeni are asking for. They're asking for political self-determination. So we need to kind of up our high horses and stop judging them on account of their poverty or maybe the fact that they're not Western as we would like them to be. Those people are actually entitled to their history and their identity. We have to respect this. If we're actually serious about democracy and international law, we're talking about respect today. But respect comes by respecting the truth. Yemen is entitled to its truth. We ought to listen to its people and our perpetual kind of, I would say, over analysis where we're actually speaking over the Yemeni people. They are entitled to speak up and we need to listen. When we do this, I think that dynamics will change.
Well, thank you so much, Catherine. Catherine Shekdam, author and expert on Yemen. Thank you.
My pleasure.